3. A slave's testimony admitted only under Basanos torture. 2. A girl sold at the slave market. 1. The child of an enslaved woman born already in chains. This is no legend. It is written in Athenian law and carved into stone. In the next few minutes, you will see children torn from their families and sold as merchandise bodies, reduced to breeding assets, and laws so precise that a scream counted only when forced out by the lash. At the end, we will display a full source list and illustrations comment source if you want them. This is Damaris, 13 years old, seized from Thrace in a raid. Her only privilege was survival long enough to be sold. The cost was her name, her family, her humanity reduced to the level of a household tool. This detail survives in ancient texts and archaeological evidence. The methods varied across time, but the logic was constant, the body as instrument. The Athenians had a word for this doul, a living tool. From freedom to ownership. The social consequences were stark. No marriage, no recognized motherhood, no legal personhood. It applied everywhere, from the humblest oikos to the vast state-run textile workshops. Consider Cleon, a 40-year-old workshop master. The law allowed him to turn dozens of women into living spindles. City rules transformed their bodies into production units. The result was exhaustion violence and children born into a system where citizenship was forever denied. One legal brand sealed it all: Basanos. It was not merely interrogation. It was a legal condition: loss of truth, loss of credibility, loss of voice. To remove this label, nearly impossible. Imagine the paradox in the Agora citizens debated philosophy and liberty. In the same city, enslaved women were flogged in public to confirm testimony. Athens exalted reason while legalizing pain. And coming up the auction block, where young girls were inspected like livestock, where breeding value was tallied in receipts, and where law itself transformed human beings into property. Want Part 2, to uncover what Athens never meant you to see. Comment, twist. They came at dawn, when mist still clung to the fields, and the dogs had not yet barked. A girl might be huddled beside her mother, still half asleep, when the sudden crash of bronze on wood shattered everything. The Athenians, or their allies or pirates feeding their markets, did not announce themselves with warning. They announced themselves with torches, spears, and fire. Villages far from the gleaming marble of the Acropolis were reduced to supply depots for human flesh. For some, the capture began on battlefields. Defeat meant more than the loss of land. It meant the stripping of families into human currency. For others, it was debt. A father who could not pay a creditor might settle the account by surrendering a daughter. The arithmetic was cold and accepted 600 drachmas, owed 600 drachmas, redeemed in flesh. In such moments, love collapsed into ledger entries. Even children of slaves born into bondage never tasted freedom. The law recognized no difference between livestock born of livestock and daughters born of enslaved women. Birth itself became a chain. Imagine being 8 years old, pressed between strangers shackled by iron for the first time. You do not understand the words the guards bark, only the sound of coins exchanged, the rough tug at your arm. A name once whispered with affection becomes useless noise. By the time the convoy reaches Athens, it is gone, replaced by a working name chosen by someone who sees you as an object, not a person. The The slave markets of Athens, especially the bustling stalls near the Agora and the district by the Piraeus, turned these tragedies into routine commerce. Girls from Thrace, Phrygia, Lydia or the Black Sea were marched in lines, their skin raw from travel, their eyes dulled by hunger. Buyers gathered not with pity, but with an appraiser's calculation. Skin tone, hip width, teeth, calluses, scars, all became criteria. A child's laughter, once treasured in her village, was now irrelevant. The only value was how many years of labor or how many children she could yield. The system had its own economic logic, cruel but efficient. Female slaves embodied a double utility: they could labor and they could reproduce. A man buying a 12-year-old girl could imagine 2 decades of grinding grain, hauling water, weaving cloth, and perhaps 6, 7, or 8 children, each one adding to his household wealth or ready for resale. Aristotle himself coldly noted that a slave was a living tool. For women, the definition expanded: a tool of work and a tool of womb. This arithmetic saturated Athenian society. Receipts and contracts survive in fragments recording the purchase of one Thracian girl unmarked suitable for service. The phrasing reads like inventory management. In court cases, debt settlements sometimes list a daughter's transfer alongside cattle or land. To the system, her body was simply another form of collateral. The stripping ritual at auction finalized the transformation. Newly captured girls were washed with cold water and scrubbed with pumice, not for kindness, but to present clean surfaces for inspection. Olive oil was rubbed into their skin, making them gleam under sunlight, as if polish could disguise trauma. Their hair was combed and painted with ochre. In a grotesque parody of festival preparation, they were made beautiful for sale. Behind this spectacle lurked an ancient truth. Pain was invisible if the surface looked pleasing. When the auctioneer's voice rose, the crowd responded with bids as if they were wagering at a game. Buyers pointed tested limbs, pried mouths open to inspect teeth. Strong enough for weaving, one might say. Hips wide for birthing another. The girl stood in silence, taught already that tears diminished value. If she fetched a higher price than the one before her, there might be a flicker of relief. But it was the relief of knowing she was now considered a more profitable object, nothing more. What the Athenians achieved, hidden beneath their reputation for democracy and philosophy, was the normalization of this commerce. Slavery was not a side note. It was the machinery that kept their economy humming. The port of Piraeus bustled not only with olive oil and silver, but with human traffic. The textile workshops that clothed citizens, the households that raised children, the symposiums where men debated freedom, all were staffed, sustained, and financed by enslaved bodies, many of them female. The erasure of identity was not accidental, but systematic. Names were Latinized or Hellenized. Foreign accents beaten out, languages silenced. A girl from Lydia might wake one morning unable to recall the songs of her childhood, replaced instead by commands barked in Greek. Identity was not merely stolen, it was overwritten. And yet, in whispered corners, enslaved women sometimes clung to fragments. A lullaby hummed in Thracian, a gesture from home, a scrap of cloth hidden like contraband. These acts were not large enough to defy the system, but they were large enough to preserve humanity. Thus, capture was never just a single event. It was a process, a chain of transformations: child into property, daughter into commodity, body into capital. From the moment of seizure to the branding iron at the market, every step reinforced the same lesson that Athens' brilliance rested on lives broken, priced, and sold. The contradiction is stark. A city that built temples to wisdom and liberty also built its prosperity on the screams of children torn from their mothers. The ledgers of democracy were balanced with human bodies. And this was only the beginning. Once purchased, the girl's journey into the oikos, the Athenian household would reveal a new form of captivity. The home celebrated in poetry as the heart of Greek life was for enslaved women, both prison and factory, a place where labor obedience and exposure to constant violation fused into daily reality. If capture and sale were the violent beginning, the household, the oikos, was the cage in which that violence settled into routine. For female slaves in Athens, the oikos was not just a workplace. It was a prison, a theatre, and often the first site of violation. The roles assigned to enslaved women were varied, but each circled the same axis of intimacy. Unlike male slaves, who might toil in fields, quarries, or workshops away from the master's private sphere, women were drawn into the household's beating heart. They prepared food, tended the loom, fetched water-scrubbed floors, soothed children, and attended the mistress of the house at every hour. They were present in kitchens, bedrooms, nurseries, and even bathhouses spaces, where the boundary between labor and exposure collapsed entirely. Consider the textile workshops attached to many wealthy homes. These were not small rooms, but large, echoing spaces filled with looms, where lines of enslaved women worked from dawn until exhaustion. They spun thread-wove cloth and stitched garments that clothed citizens and filled market stalls. The rhythm of the shuttle became the rhythm of their days. A mistake, a dropped stitch, a frayed thread was not forgiven. Overseers wielded sticks as constant reminders that error was both costly and punishable. These women rarely saw the agora or the open sky. Their world was measured in threads, wool dust, and the crack of commands. Others served as wet nurses feeding infants who were not their own. An enslaved woman's milk was considered a household resource diverted from her own child to nourish the master's offspring. Ancient authors even advised selecting nurses based on temperament and diet, believing a woman's moral character would pass through her milk. In this way, the bodies of enslaved women literally infused the citizen class, sustaining Athenian children, even as their own were sold away or neglected. Domestic service was no less invasive. From grinding grain at the mortar to hauling amphorae of water up narrow stairs, the physical toll was relentless. The duties extended beyond labor into surveillance. A slave girl stood silently by the mistress as she prepared her toilette, or hovered during meals, refilling wine cups and cleaning spills. The intimacy of these spaces made female slaves constantly visible, yet perpetually voiceless. To exist in such proximity to free citizens, but be denied recognition as human, was its own form of torment. The structure of the household itself deepened this captivity. Walls and courtyards created layers of enclosure. Women of the citizen family rarely stepped beyond the inner chambers. Enslaved women even less so. A kitchen, a loom room, a dark storage space. These became the horizons of their existence. And because the oikos was both a private dwelling and an economic unit, the enslaved woman's every gesture carried weight. Drop a tray and you were clumsy. Pause too long at a task and you were lazy. Look up at a guest and you were insolent. The rules of invisibility governed survival to be useful but not noticeable, present but not present. The distinction between male and female slavery was stark. A man might be whipped for disobedience, but once his labor was finished, his body was not demanded in the same way. A woman's role was continuous. Her body was a tool of labor by day and potentially a tool of pleasure by night. The constant intimacy of the oikos meant that sexual vulnerability was never absent. A slave girl carrying water through the courtyard could be summoned into a bedchamber as easily as she could be ordered back to the kitchen. No law shielded her. No voice could defend her. The household, celebrated in Greek literature as the anchor of civic life, concealed these daily degradations behind marble walls. Yet fragments of resistance flicker even here. Tragedians occasionally allowed enslaved women's laments to echo on stage. Euripides' plays, for example, contain moments where servant women voice grief at endless toil or weep for lost children. These may be stylized lines written by free men, but they suggest an awareness of the quiet despair that haunted the kitchens and looms of Athens. In vase paintings, too, one can glimpse the silhouettes of women at looms bent over their work, anonymous figures whose labor supported the very culture that erased them. The economic logic was inescapable. A household might purchase one girl for her skill at weaving, another for her strong back, another for her beauty. Each role was chosen not with her humanity in mind, but with calculation. The weaver kept cloth flowing, the nurse kept infants alive. The domestic slave ensured meals and order. The beautiful girl might secure the master's pleasure, or fetch a higher resale value later. Together, they formed the invisible scaffolding of the citizen's life. For the enslaved woman, however, the oikos was not a single role, but a shifting maze. She might begin as a kitchen slave, be reassigned to the loom room, pressed into nursing, or elevated if beauty dictated to serve as a personal attendant. Each shift brought new dangers, new proximity to power, new exposure to exploitation. The only constant was this: her life was not hers to shape. It was a resource to be extracted, managed, and consumed. Athens boasted of freedom philosophy and the pursuit of excellence. But within the walls of the oikos, enslaved women lived a reality that contradicted every civic ideal. The home was their workplace and their prison, a site of endless tasks and silent terrors. And yet, it was also the engine that powered Athenian society. Without their hidden labor, the polis could not have clothed, fed, or raised its citizens. This was the paradox of the doulai, the enslaved women of Athens. Their roles were intimate, indispensable, and yet always dehumanizing. They lived at the heart of the household and the margins of humanity. Xenophon, the Athenian soldier and writer, once gave advice that still chills across centuries. In his O Economicus, a household management manual, he described female slaves as creatures who could be trained like animals. The phrase was not a metaphor for him. It was instruction. To Athenian masters, obedience was not assumed. It was engineered. And the oikos, that great pillar of Athenian life, was also a laboratory of control. Training began immediately after purchase. A girl taken from the market was stripped not only of her clothes but of her former self. Her name was often replaced with something simpler, something Roman or Greek, easier for the mistress or overseer to command. Identity was the first thing to be erased. In its place, a new grammar of obedience was imposed. Surveillance was constant. The domina, the mistress of the house, oversaw the training of female slaves with an eye both jealous and practical. A crooked hem, a poorly ground measure of barley, an unpolished floor. Each mistake was a pretext for punishment. The overseer, often a trusted older slave, enforced these rules with lash or rod. Nothing was too small to escape scrutiny. In the kitchen, in the loom room, in the nursery, a girl learned that she was always being watched. The punishments were calibrated to break will without destroying the body, because the body remained valuable. A late task might earn a beating across the shoulders. Speaking out of turn might mean days without food. Even laughter could be dangerous, as it suggested freedom of spirit. The system was designed not just to punish disobedience, but to anticipate it, to make a girl discipline herself before the rod ever fell. Silence was one of the first lessons. Words had to be rationed like rain. A slave who spoke too much invited reprimand, but one who spoke too little risked being seen as sullen. The perfect balance was invisibility present enough to be useful, absent enough not to irritate. Over time, girls learned to read subtle cues, the flick of a mistress's hand, the tone of a master's sigh, and respond instantly. Delay was dangerous. Hesitation was costly. This training was framed as rational, even virtuous. In Oeconomicus, Xenophon has a master instruct his wife on how to manage slaves, comparing their conditioning to the taming of animals. Food was a tool. Praise and reward, slightly better rations, a brief reprieve from labor were given. Sparingly, just enough to create dependency. Withdrawal of food or comfort reinforced the lesson. Like a horse responding to rein and bit, the slave girl learned to link survival with obedience. But behind the clinical language lay a world of fear. Imagine the daily rhythm: rise before dawn, fetch water, grind, barley weave until fingers bled. The dominer passes, inspects the work, finds fault. A lash across the back. At dinner, stand silent in the corner ready to refill cups. A glance mistaken for insolence. Another punishment. The training never ended because obedience was not a skill to master, but a state to maintain. The household's architecture itself reinforced this system. Rooms for slaves were small, windowless, tucked away near kitchens or storage areas. Light and air were reserved for citizens. Doors and corridors funneled movement, ensuring that a slave's path was predictable and supervised. The design of space mirrored the design of authority, to restrict, to observe, to command. The psychological toll was immense. Enslaved girls quickly learned the rule of invisibility. The less you existed as a person, the safer you were. Yet, invisibility was impossible, for their bodies were always present, always scrutinized. This paradox, be unseen, yet always seen, eroded any sense of self. Over weeks and months, survival demanded that a girl become what her master wanted her to be. Silent, efficient, compliant. Occasionally, fragments of humanity leaked through. An enslaved nurse might hum a lullaby from her homeland as she rocked an Athenian child. A kitchen slave might whisper a joke to a companion in stolen seconds of respite. These tiny acts were dangerous, but necessary reminders that they were more than tools. Yet, the system's genius lay in how thoroughly it punished such slips. A court whisper could mean a knight shackled. A forgotten tune could bring the whip. The metrics of success were chillingly clear. A well-trained female slave did not just work efficiently. She anticipated needs, endured punishments without protest, and even participated in training newcomers. When a new girl arrived trembling from the market, It was often other slaves who taught her how to survive, when to bow her head, how to hide her tears, how to avoid the dominor's wrath. In this way, the system reproduced itself. Slaves, once broken, became instruments of breaking others. Athens celebrated itself as the cradle of democracy and philosophy. But within its households, it conducted experiments in obedience more sophisticated than any theory of governance. The oikos was a microcosm of control food, as leverage punishment, as pedagogy surveillance, as constant as air. Xenophon's words train them like animals were not exaggeration. They were a blueprint. And so the doulai, the enslaved women, lived lives shaped not by their own choices, but by a continuous curriculum of subjugation. They were students in a school of silence, taught that every gesture of disobedience carried a cost. By the time girlhood gave way to womanhood, obedience was not merely expected, it was ingrained, etched into bone and breath. In the polished marble courts of Athens, words had extraordinary weight. Oratory shaped laws, swayed juries, and decided the fates of generals and citizens alike. But if you were enslaved, especially a woman, your words were not trusted. The law declared that your voice was unreliable unless extracted under pain. This was the principle of basanos, literally the touchstone. A method to test truth, not by reasoned argument, but by screams. To Athenian citizens, this was legal common sense. They believed a slave would never speak honestly if not compelled, that only agony could strip away deception. And so the legal framework itself demanded torture as evidence. In a society that prided itself on democracy, equality before the law, isonomia, and the eloquence of debate, there existed a parallel truth. Enslaved women were condemned to speak only through suffering. The courtroom procedure could be chillingly formal. Suppose a master wanted to use the testimony of his female slave in a property dispute. He would present her body, not her statement. The magistrate would order the basanos. Under supervision, she could be flogged, burned, or stretched until her voice broke into the desired confession. The words recorded were not hers alone, but the product of orchestrated pain. For the jurors, this was not cruelty, but legal method. For her, it was another confirmation that her humanity did not exist in the eyes of the polis. Punishment extended far beyond the courts. The same principle that pain revealed truth and ensured order shaped everyday discipline. Whipping was the most common tool, and it was not hidden behind closed doors. Masters staged it in public civic spaces, reminders carved in flesh, as clearly as laws were carved in stone. Along the bustling agora near the banks of the Eridanos River or outside state workshops, enslaved women could be beaten for failed tasks for defiance, or simply to reinforce hierarchy. These punishments were demonstrative. A lash in the household might correct one slave. A lash in public corrected all who watched. In the eyes of Athens, this visibility was part of the system. Civic spaces, which also hosted philosophical debates, poetry recitations, and democratic assemblies, doubled as theatres of pain. The whip cracked not just across a woman's back, but across the conscience of the city, reminding every passerby where power resided. Writers of the time described these practices without shock, as if they were as natural as the market stalls. Demosthenes, in Against One Tor, mentions a slave woman whose testimony was deemed valid only after coercion proof of how law and violence were intertwined. Aristophanes' comedies toss off casual references to slaves being whipped, showing how normalized the spectacle had become. The laughter of the theatre masked the cries of real women outside. The instruments of punishment were themselves symbols. The mastics, the leather whip, appeared in vase paintings. Its image was a shorthand for slavery, as recognizable to an Athenian as the olive branch or hoplite spear. To depict a slave with a whip nearby was enough to convey her status, her vulnerability, her subjection. The material culture of Athens preserved the whip as an everyday object, as familiar as a cooking pot or loom. For the enslaved women who endured it, each punishment was both physical agony and social branding. A flogging in the agora was not just pain, it was humiliation before citizens, a public stripping of dignity. The memory of the lash lived in muscle and scar, but also in the eyes of neighbors who had witnessed her degradation. The body carried the wound, the community carried the knowledge. There is an unsettling paradox here. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, staged its punishments openly, as if cruelty itself was civic performance. Where citizens gathered to hear Pericles speak of liberty, enslaved women might be chained and whipped within sight. Where Socrates urged Athenians to question virtue slaves screamed under rods. These were not contradictions hidden from view. They were contradictions embraced, woven into the same civic fabric. Why did Athenians believe pain was truth? Part of it lies in their concept of hierarchy. Citizens possessed reason. Slaves, they thought, did not. Thus, a citizen's oath in court carried weight by itself, while a slave's oath meant nothing. To bridge that gap, torture became the translator. It turned screams into evidence, agony into proof. This belief was so strong that even if a slave's testimony contradicted a citizen's, jurors often trusted the confession wrung from pain. In their eyes, pain was incorruptible, a godlike solvent of lies. Other Greek polis shared aspects of this practice, but Athens gave it a civic sheen. Sparta enforced obedience through brutal training and military discipline. But it was in Athens that torture was codified into legal frameworks, given the respectability of process. It was not rage or whim, it was procedure, as if cruelty gained legitimacy once it wore the robes of law. For the enslaved women, this meant living under a perpetual shadow. At any moment, their bodies could be requisitioned not only for labor, but for evidence. Their skin could become a courtroom. Their screams could become testimony. Their silence could be taken as guilt. To be a slave was to know that your voice was never yours, only a tool others could unlock with the lash. Thus, the law of pain operated on two levels, disciplining the individual and reinforcing the social order. It trained enslaved women to anticipate punishment, to monitor themselves endlessly, because any slip might land them before whip or magistrate. And it trained citizens to see this as normal, as necessary as the price of their liberty. Athens celebrated itself as a city of reason. Yet its legal foundations for enslaved women rested not on argument or evidence, but on blood and cries. In that contradiction lies one of the darkest truths of antiquity, that democracy, at least for some, required tyranny for others. Among all the tools of Athenian life, the loom, the stylus, the spear, few carried more symbolic weight than the whip, known as the mastics. This strip of leather, reinforced with knots or bits of bone, was the ever-present shadow in the life of an enslaved woman. To Athenians, it was both an instrument of control and an emblem of order. To the enslaved, it was a constant reminder that pain was never more than an arm's reach away. The whip appeared not only in the slave quarters, but in art and literature, woven into the cultural imagination. On painted vases where heroes and gods were immortalized, one often sees small hunched figures in the background holding tools of their status. Sometimes it is a jug of wine, sometimes a basket of wool, but often it is a whip, curled like a serpent in their hands. These were not accidental details. They told every viewer at the symposium who was master and who was mastered, who wielded the right to strike, and who lived under its sting. In comedies, the whip was a punchline. Aristophanes, ever the satirist, could raise laughter by suggesting a slave deserved a beating for stupidity. The audience roared not out of malice alone, but because the joke assumed universality. Everyone knew the crack of the mastics. It was the background music of Athenian life echoing from kitchens, workshops, and courtyards. When cruelty becomes comedy, it reveals how deeply it has seeped into the fabric of society. But for enslaved women, the whip was no abstraction. It had texture, weight, rhythm. It bit into backs during public floggings, tore at legs when labor slowed, or landed across faces as punishment for perceived insolence. Masters and mistresses wielded it interchangeably. The domina of a household guarding her dignity often used it to discipline young girls for failing in their domestic tasks. Overseers carried it openly on estates and in workshops, more visible than any other tool, a badge of authority more effective than words. What made the whip terrifying was not just the pain, but the uncertainty. It could fall at any time for reasons as trivial as spilling grain or failing to lower one's eyes quickly enough. The unpredictability trained enslaved women to live in constant vigilance. They walked, carried, cooked, and cleaned as though under an invisible lash. Their backs bore scars, but their minds bore deeper wounds, the perpetual calculation of how to move without triggering punishment. Athens did not hide this violence. Punishments were public, and the whip's sound was part of the city's acoustic landscape. Citizens shopping in the agora could hear a slave punished nearby. Children walking to lessons passed by flogged bodies. The line between civic life and cruelty blurred until the two became indistinguishable. The whip, like the temple or the theatre, belonged to the shared identity of the polis. Philosophers noticed even if they did not condemn. Plato in his Laws and Aristotle in his Politics spoke of slaves as animate tools necessary for the functioning of the household and the city. The whip was the means by which these tools were kept in order. Its presence was rationalized as natural, just as the plough belonged to the field and the oar to the ship. To question it would be to question the structure of Athens itself. And so the mastics became more than leather and knots. It became language. Athenians used the whip metaphorically in speech, to lash with words, to drive like slaves. Even when absent, it lingered in imagery, a ghostly reinforcement of hierarchy. Citizens could joke about it, philosophers could theorize about it, artists could paint it, and all the while enslaved women felt its reality across their skin. Imagine a young girl, perhaps 14, grinding grain in the dim light of dawn. The whip hangs on a hook in the corner, silent but unavoidable. Every creak of leather reminds her of yesterday's strike and the one that might come tomorrow. She does not need to see it moving to feel its power. It governs her posture, her silence, the pace of her hands. In this way, the whip disciplined even when it did not fall. It colonized thought as much as its scarred flesh. Generations grew up with this normalization. Athenian children, future citizens, watched slaves flogged and absorbed the lesson. Democracy meant freedom for some, dependence on coercion for others. The whip taught hierarchy without the need for philosophy. It was the silent tutor of inequality, shaping citizens who could argue passionately for liberty in the assembly, yet laugh at the sight of a woman beaten in the street. Archaeology confirms the ubiquity of whips and flogging. Marks on bones suggest repeated blows, while iron rings set into walls of workshops reveal where bodies were tied for punishment. The implements themselves rarely survive being leather and organic, but the cultural record of the paintings, the plays, the laws testify to their constant presence. Thus, the whip must be understood as more than an object. It was a system, a symbol, and a signal. It told the enslaved that obedience was survival. It told citizens that order was preserved. And it told history that Athens' ideals of freedom were built on the sound of cracking leather. The mastix was not merely in the hand of the master, it was embedded in the conscience of the city. If the whip was the ever-present threat, the brand was the eternal scar. For many enslaved women in Athens, the terror of the lash ended with pain that eventually faded. But the mark of bronze or iron, pressed red-hot into living flesh, never disappeared. It transformed a human being into certified property, an inventory item with proof of ownership seared onto her skin. The practice was not universal, but it was widespread enough to become part of Athenian culture, particularly in places where enslaved women labored under direct civic or commercial supervision. Bathhouses, taverns, textile workshops, and state-regulated brothels were notorious for this practice. Here, masters and overseers feared both escape and impersonation. A scar solved the problem. Unlike shackles, which could be unlocked, or documents which could be forged, a brand was inescapable. Sources hint at the ubiquity of these marks. Comic playwrights joked about slaves branded on the forehead. Legal texts describe transactions where officials, the polity, checked for signs of permanent marking before certifying a sale. The historian Aulus Gellius, writing centuries later, refers to the stigmata of servitude. Even if the surviving texts cloak the cruelty in euphemism, the meaning is clear. The branded body was as much a commodity certificate as a jug of oil stamped with a maker's seal. The process itself was excruciating. A rod or iron stamp heated in a brazier applied to the skin until the flesh bubbled and burned. For women, the mark often fell where it could never be hidden: the forehead, the cheek, the upper arm. It was deliberate. The body itself became a walking proclamation of status. There was no escape into anonymity. Even if an enslaved woman fled and shed her chains, the scar would betray her, exposing her as stolen property to every passerby. Branding was not just punishment, it was administration. It created a permanent category, dividing humanity into those who carried scars and those who did not. For enslaved women, it meant the erasure of all other identities. Whatever name they once bore, whatever gods they once prayed to, whatever family they once belonged to, all were overshadowed by the sign etched into their flesh. Consider the setting: a bathhouse where water steamed and voices echoed. An enslaved woman pouring oil or scrubbing tiles might have carried a brand on her brow visible to every bather. Her presence reminded Athenians of the invisible infrastructure of their leisure, the luxury of warm water and perfumed oil rested on the pain of bodies marked as less than human. The scar was not simply functional, it was symbolic. It announced hierarchy, reminding citizen and foreigner alike of the clear boundaries between freedom and servitude. Archaeology offers silent witnesses. At sites across the Greek world, bronze branding irons have been found shaped like letters or symbols. Some scholars argue they represented household emblems, others civic insignia. Their very survival testifies to repeated use. And skeletal remains sometimes reveal bone deformations, consistent with burns, the ghostly residue of human flesh once scorched. The stigma carried social as well as physical weight. A branded woman could never pass as free. If she bore children, the mark proclaimed their inherited status too. It closed doors before they could ever open. The philosopher Dio Chrysostom centuries later wrote of a slave whose branded face spoke her shame before she uttered a word. In that phrase we hear the logic of the system, the mark silenced, testimony, identity, and dignity, replacing them with a scar that spoke louder than any voice. Imagine the moment itself. A girl, perhaps 15, held down by two men while the iron heats. The overseer tests its glow, then presses it against her skin. She smells her own flesh burning before she feels the full pain. She tries not to scream because screams feed laughter. When it is over, she is pushed aside, her tears mixing with ash and sweat. From that day forward, she is no longer simply a slave. She is the branded one. Athens saw this as necessity. Escape was costly, rebellion, dangerous. Marks made people trackable. But in making safety for the master, the system destroyed possibility for the enslaved. It was a one-way transformation. Even manumission, the rare granting of freedom, could not erase a scar. Some freed women lived the rest of their lives marked as property long after the legal bonds were lifted. The contradiction cuts deep. This was a city that carved statues of perfect beauty, white marble flesh, untouched by imperfection. And yet, it burned ugliness into living women, ensuring they carried permanent disfigurement. The mark on stone celebrated ideals. The mark on skin enforced reality. Athens' pride in its art and order rested on the same bronze that scarred enslaved faces. To the citizen, branding was efficient management. To the enslaved, it was the theft of a future. And to history, it remains one of the most chilling reminders that civilization can polish marble with one hand while pressing hot iron with the other. Before dawn, long before the cock crowed or the marketplace stirred, the enslaved women of Athens were already at work. For them, the oikos, the household, was not sanctuary, but prison and workshop combined. It was a space where the rhythms of daily life rested entirely on their bodies, where labor began before the city awoke and did not end until darkness swallowed the last flicker of lamplight. Their tasks were relentless. Grain had to be ground into flour with heavy stone querns, a back-breaking process that wore grooves into the knees and palms of those who performed it day after day. Water had to be fetched from public fountains, carried in heavy jars that cut into the skin of shoulders and arms. Fires had to be tended, ash-scraped pots scoured. Looms clattered as fingers blistered from weaving. Infants had to be nursed, whether the women's own or their masters', because milk itself was considered a commodity to to be transferred from enslaved breasts to freeborn mouths. Every corner of the house demanded attention. Every breath was consumed by labor. Literary sources speak with chilling nonchalance. Xenophon, in his Oeconomicus, describes how female slaves should be trained to manage provisions, weave, and oversee domestic order. He speaks of them as tools no different from plows or oxen, except that they required discipline. Euripides' tragedies give us a glimpse of their voices. Enslaved women lament their endless toil weaving and nursing while mourning lost homes and families. Through fragments of drama, the truth flickers. These were not invisible hands, but exhausted bodies forced to sustain Athenian households without pause. The work itself was intimate. Unlike male slaves who might toil in the fields or workshops, women moved through kitchens, bedrooms, and nurseries. They were present at moments of vulnerability, bathing birth illness, and that presence carried constant risk. The proximity between service and exposure meant that exploitation was always close. To cook a meal was also to risk a beating for under-seasoned bread. To bathe a child was also to risk humiliation if the mistress suspected affection. To nurse a master's infant was also to surrender one's body on command. The oikos itself was designed to reinforce control. Rooms for slaves were small, tucked away, and sometimes windowless. Movement was surveilled by the domina, the mistress of the house, and by male overseers whose authority extended to punishment. Privacy did not exist. An enslaved woman might share space with half a dozen others sleeping on hard floors, rising when summoned. Even laughter could be interpreted as insolence, silence as sullenness, tears as weakness. The body was measured not by health or dignity, but by productivity. Exhaustion was not an accident, it was a tool. To grind grain until arms trembled to carry water, until knees buckled to weave, until the fingers bled, all ensured that there was little energy left for rebellion. Hunger added to the weight rations were calculated to sustain labor, but never indulgence. And food itself could be withheld as punishment. Through labor and deprivation, obedience was carved as surely as branding irons carved flesh. Yet even in this monotony, moments of humanity flickered. Some enslaved women whispered songs from their homelands as they wove passing down fragments of culture forbidden but not forgotten. Others consoled each other after beatings binding wounds with strips of old cloth or stolen wine. In tragedies performed on Athenian stages, audiences sometimes wept at the laments of enslaved women, characters, even while enslaved women in real households remained invisible. The irony was cruel. The suffering of fictional slaves could be art, but the suffering of real women was economy. Archaeology deepens the picture. In excavated houses of Athens and Piraeus, the smallest side rooms lacking windows and close to kitchens are believed to have been slave quarters. Grinding stones, loom weights, and child-sized ceramic feeding vessels hint at the endless tasks of women who worked and nursed there. Skeletal remains sometimes show signs of repetitive strain, curved spines, worn joints, teeth eroded from holding threads in weaving. The body itself became a document of servitude. The silence of records is telling. Citizen women's voices appear occasionally in inscriptions or dedications. Male citizens fill speeches, laws, and histories. Enslaved women appear only as shadows, as wet nurse, as maidservant, as foreign girl. Their names vanish into the anonymity of function. That silence is not accidental. It reflects a system that demanded their presence, but erased their identity, making them both indispensable and invisible. Imagine a single day, a young girl, perhaps 10, forced to rise in darkness. She drags water jars from the fountain, stumbles under their weight, then turns to knead dough to tend the fire to clean ashes. She weaves under the gaze of the mistress, careful never to speak unless spoken to. She nurses a freeborn infant while her own hunger gnaws. At night, she curls on the floor beside others, muscles aching, listening for the footsteps that might summon her again. This day will repeat tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. To Athens, this was simply the functioning of the household. To the enslaved, it was unending exhaustion, a slow erasure of self through labor. And yet, through fragments of literature, through bones and ruins, we glimpse their endurance. They remind us that beneath the marble and rhetoric of Athens was a foundation built on the backs of women whose endless toil sustained the so-called birthplace of democracy. The walls of the Athenian oikos enclosed more than work. They also enclosed the most private corners of life bedrooms, nurseries, bathing spaces. And in those spaces, the line between labor and violation dissolved completely. For enslaved women, service often meant exposure. To tend the fire was to be seen. To fetch the bathwater was to be touched. To sleep on the floor outside the master's chamber was to wait for the door to open in the night. Athenian law offered no protections. Freeborn women could appeal to family honor and social shame, though even they were tightly bound by patriarchy. Enslaved women, however, had no legal standing. They could not marry, could not refuse, could not testify without torture. Their bodies were considered extensions of household property, and thus any use of them, whether for labor, reproduction, or pleasure, was framed not as violation, but as prerogative. A slave woman could be punished for resisting not her assailant for forcing. Texts from the period speak with chilling casualness. Xenophon treats enslaved women as animals to be trained, not as people to be protected. Demosthenes, in his speeches, distinguishes between citizen wives for childbearing concubines, for pleasure, and slaves for daily use. That phrase for use summed up the condition, a body without rights available whenever the master chose. The law recognized injury only if it affected the owner's property value, not the woman's dignity. The household mistress, the kira or domina, often became both overseer and rival. Her power over enslaved women included punishments, and her suspicion often fell hardest on those considered attractive. A slave girl seen as beautiful might be beaten for imagined insolence, starved for perceived seduction, humiliated in front of others. The mistress's jealousy was not unfounded. Sexual access was part of her husband's prerogatives. But the fury was displaced downward onto the powerless girl who could neither consent nor resist. Even the architecture reveals this intimacy. Archaeologists note how slave quarters were often positioned near bedrooms or kitchens, ensuring constant availability. Proximity meant surveillance, but also constant vulnerability. A girl assigned to serve in the master's chamber might spend her nights waiting for the sound of sandals on stone, a signal that she would be summoned inside. Silence was survival. Those who spoke of such nights risked beatings or worse. The marketplace compounded the exposure. Female slaves were displayed, stripped, examined in public auctions. Buyers checked teeth and limbs, but also hips and breasts, openly discussing reproductive and sexual value. Inscriptions and surviving contracts sometimes record proven fertility or suitable for companionship alongside prices. The economy codified the body as commodity domestic service. Weaving skill milk supply and sexual use all factored into a single transaction. Athenian comedy even made sport of it. In Aristophanes' plays, jokes about slave girls' sexuality drew laughter from citizen audiences. The humor depended on erasure, the normalization of abuse as entertainment. What the stage presented as laughter, the enslaved endured as life. The psychological toll was immense. To work under constant surveillance was one form of exhaustion. To live with constant threat of violation was another. Older women counseled younger ones in whispered fragments how to avoid notice, how to make oneself invisible, how to detach when the inevitable happened. Dissociation became a survival tactic centuries before the term existed, minds fleeing where bodies could not. The children born from such encounters lived in limbo. They belonged automatically to the household, never to the mother. If the father was the master, the law denied legitimacy. If the father was another slave, the child remained property. In either case, the woman bore the pain and risk, but never the authority. Aristotle himself wrote that slaves were living tools, and the children of slaves were simply new tools fashioned from old. Yet, fragments of resistance surface. Some enslaved women found ways to control reproduction using herbs or secret rituals to prevent conception. Others attempted escape during pregnancies, though recapture often meant branding or execution. Still others preserved dignity through song, prayer, or the stubborn act of remembering their birth names. These were fragile shields, but they mattered reminders that even in the most intimate violation, humanity endured. To Athens, this was ordinary. To the women, it was a life of constant vulnerability, a body made into currency. The same city that praised freedom of speech and equality, before the law, reduced half its enslaved population to silent vessels denied voice choice, and even the right to refuse touch. The contradiction was not hidden. It was woven into the very fabric of Athenian democracy liberty, for citizens' exposure for slaves. The story of sexual vulnerability in Athens is not an aside. It is central. It reveals how domination extended beyond fields and workshops, into the bedchamber and nursery, how intimacy itself became an arena of power. And it forces us to confront the darker truth that a society celebrated for philosophy and politics built its glory on women who lived without the right to their own bodies. The Agora of Athens was more than a market. It was the beating civic heart of the city, the place where citizens debated law, exchanged goods, and celebrated their identity as free men. But for enslaved women, the Agora could transform into something else entirely, a stage of humiliation. The same marble paving stones that hosted philosophical dialogues also bore witness to whippings, brandings, and public shaming. In Athens, punishment was not simply a matter of discipline. It was a theatre of power. The Athenians believed that public demonstration reinforced social order. A household mistress might punish a girl behind closed doors, but the polis preferred spectacles that reminded both slave and citizen of the rigid boundaries of status. Whipping was the most common form. A woman accused of insolence or minor theft could be dragged to civic spaces stripped and lashed in plain view. The sound of leather striking flesh echoed against the colonnades, while passers-by paused not to object, but to observe. The very visibility of pain was the point. To punish in secret would have risked sympathy, To punish in public normalized cruelty. When a female slave's testimony was required in court, she was often tortured openly, the basanos, on the assumption that only suffering could yield truth. This was not considered shameful for the city, but proof of its orderliness. Pain was transformed into civic evidence. Spaces carried meaning. Along the banks of the Eridanos River, near workshops where state-owned slaves toiled, floggings took place as if to bind labor to discipline. In the agora itself, punishments unfolded in front of the very assembly that claimed to stand for liberty. To the Athenians, there was no contradiction. The suffering of slaves was framed as the necessary counterpart to the freedoms of citizens. Material culture confirms this normalization. Vase paintings show overseers holding the mastics, the whip, as casual props. These are not depictions of cruelty hidden in the shadows. They are part of the visual vocabulary of Athenian life. Just as laurels symbolized victory, whips symbolized control. And when the mastics cracked across a slave woman's back, it reminded every onlooker where power resided. The humiliation was layered. A woman might be beaten for failing at a task grinding grain too slowly, spilling water resisting unwanted advances. But once dragged into public, her punishment ceased to be personal. It became political. The pain of her body reassured citizens that hierarchy was intact, that Athens remained a city of order. Her degradation was turned into civic reassurance. Even children saw it. Imagine a boy trailing behind his father through the agora, clutching figs or amphora handles, while ahead a slave girl is whipped under the gaze of the council chamber. The boy learns in that moment democracy applies to men like his father, not to bodies like hers. The whip became a teacher writing lessons of hierarchy on human flesh. Philosophers seldom objected. Plato and Aristotle debated justice, but their frameworks assumed slavery as natural. Aristotle described slaves as tools with a soul fit for command rather than consent. Public punishment fit neatly into this logic. If slaves were animate property, then their pain was no more morally troubling than striking an ox to make it plow straighter. The spectacle of cruelty was clothed in the language of necessity. Some texts even turned it into humor. In comedies, slave beatings appear as stock gags, the audience laughing at blows that in real life left scars. The theater mirrored the agora. Both were spaces where the suffering of slaves, especially women, was absorbed into civic life without protest. And yet fragments of disquiet exist. Aeschylus's tragedies occasionally give lines of lament to enslaved women, voices that cut through the civic mask. Archaeological remains, branding irons, shackles, bones, bearing lash marks tell their own silent story. They whisper what the public square drowned out, that behind every crack of the whip stood a human being with a name, a mother, a memory. To us, the contradiction is glaring. How could the city that birthed ideals of equality also stage suffering as entertainment? But to the Athenians, there was no contradiction. Equality was never meant to include the enslaved. The spectacle of punishment was not a flaw. It was a feature. It reinforced a social contract written in exclusion and reminding every citizen that his liberty rested on the visible subjugation of others. The agora thus becomes a paradox in stone. One moment Socrates challenges men to define virtue. The next, a slave woman is flogged within earshot. One corner echoes with debates on justice, another with screams. Athens enshrined both in the same space, never seeing the hypocrisy, because the hierarchy was the foundation. Public punishment was not just discipline, it was civic theatre. It was control, rehearsed and displayed, turning individual pain into collective reassurance. And in that paradox, the contradiction of Athens reaches its clearest form, a democracy proud of liberty, performing cruelty at its very heart. Athens called itself the school of Hellas. Its citizens praised the glory of their democracy, its courts, its festivals, its theatres. They told themselves and the world that no city loved liberty more than theirs. But the reality on which that liberty rested could not be spoken of in the same proud terms. At the very moment, Pericles declared Athens an education to Greece. Enslaved women were sweeping floors in the shadows of the Parthenon, their bodies marked, their voices silenced. The fracture between the city's ideals and its practices was not hidden, it was structural. In speeches and inscriptions, Athenians celebrated isonomia equality before the law. But the law itself defined that equality narrowly. Free male citizens only. Women born free were excluded from political life. Enslaved women were excluded from humanity altogether. The doul did not appear as a person in the law courts, but as res a thing. Her word had no weight unless torn from her throat under torture. Her suffering had no standing unless it could be translated into her owner's loss of property. This silence is what makes reconstruction so difficult. We do not hear the voices of enslaved women directly. What survives are the tools of their erasure ledgers, contracts, comedy lines, court records that treat them as footnotes in disputes between men. It is through these fragments that we glimpse the reality, a society that built theatres to celebrate tragedy, yet ignored the daily tragedies inside its own households. The fracture was not only legal, but cultural. Athenian art is filled with images of balance, harmony, and proportion gods striding across painted vases, heroes locked in perfect combat. Yet the same vases also show overseers gripping whips, women bent to tasks of endless labor, and slaves caricatured for laughter. Beauty and cruelty shared the same clay. Economics bound the ideals and the cruelty together. The silver that funded Athens' fleets came from the Laurian mines worked by enslaved laborers. The textiles that clothed citizens often came from workshops filled with enslaved girls. Even the olive oil that bathed athletes in the Panathenaic Games might have been pressed by enslaved women, their hands blistered and raw. The democratic stage was illuminated by the sweat of those who had no stage, no vote, no recourse. Tragedy itself occasionally let the fracture show. In Euripides, enslaved women sometimes speak lines of lament, their grief echoing through the chorus. These moments are rare exceptions allowed within the fictional world of myth, but they pierce the silence. They remind us that behind every doul in the record, there was a person with songs, with memories, with a mother's voice still lodged in her heart. But the plays could only hint. The real city kept those voices suppressed. Athenians justified it with philosophy. Aristotle claimed that some people were slaves by nature, destined to be ruled. Xenophon compared training enslaved women to training animals. These arguments were not fringe, they were mainstream. They allowed citizens to reconcile their ideals of liberty with their practice of bondage. The fracture was papered over with words dressed in the language of necessity, even of virtue. But it was never seamless. Archaeology tells us of runaways of scars on bones of brands that show attempts to flee. Every scar is a counter-argument carved into flesh. Every act of resistance, however small, was a reminder that the fracture was real, that beneath the civic mask lay a structure trembling with contradiction. For enslaved women, the fracture was life itself. They lived in households that praised moderation while practicing excess. They carried water jars for mistresses who spoke of piety but inflicted cruelty. They nursed infants in homes where philosophers debated justice but denied them their own children. Their daily existence was the negative space that made Athenian freedom possible. Today, we admire the ruins, the Parthenon, the theatre of Dionysus, the marble stoas. But if we listen closely, we hear the silence built into them. The stones do not record the names of the enslaved women who scrubbed them clean, who prepared meals for the artisans, who carried dust and rubble away on aching backs. Athens presented itself as a beacon of freedom, but the beacon was fueled by bodies denied the very thing the city celebrated. That is the fracture. It is not a side note or an accidental inconsistency. It is the core of the story. Athens could not have been what it was without enslaved women. The democracy that inspired revolutions millennia later rested on chains that left no vote, no voice, no trace of individuality. And in that dissonance lies the truth. Freedom for some, founded on bondage for others. The ideals of Athens survive in our textbooks. The reality of the enslaved survives only in fragments, in scars on bones, in fleeting lines of drama, in the silence between laws. It is up to us to hold both together, to see the fracture not as a flaw, but as the defining contradiction of a civilization that taught liberty while practicing bondage. The story of enslaved women in Athens is not a footnote. It is the foundation. For every marble column still standing there were countless hands that ground grain, carried water-nursed infants, and endured punishments that no inscription records. Athens proclaimed liberty as its highest good, yet millions of women across the Greek world were denied even the right to be recognized as persons. This contradiction is not incidental. It is the engine that drove the city's prosperity. Historians estimate that 1 in 3 residents of Athens in the classical period was enslaved. Roughly half of those were female. Across the wider Greek world, that may amount to 5 million women over centuries of empire, 5 million names erased. Each one lived a life as rich in feeling and fear, as capable of joy and sorrow as any citizen who sat in the assembly or on a jury. But their lives were compressed into numbers, sale prices, ledgers, lists of tasks, scars of ownership. The silence in the record is itself a testimony. We do not know what they sang to their children in the brief hours before those children were sold. We do not know the names whispered between girls in slave quarters before they were branded. We do not know what prayers they offered in languages Athens refused to hear. Their absence is not an accident. It is the intended result of a system that depended on erasure. And yet fragments survive. A vase painting of a woman bent over her loom head bowed. A passage in Euripides where a chorus of enslaved women weep for their lost homeland. An inscription listing penalties for runaway slaves, evidence that escape was attempted again and again. These fragments remind us that beneath the marble rhetoric of freedom, there were human beings pushing against the weight of their chains. The legacy does not stop in antiquity. The techniques Athens used, branding forced labor, legal erasure, commodification of the body, echo through history. Roman slavery expanded the system. Plantation economies in the Americas revived it on a massive scale, citing ancient precedents. Even today, modern trafficking relies on methods Athenians would recognize: isolation, identity-stripping food, and punishment as tools of control. The rhetoric has changed, the technology has changed, but the logic remains disturbingly familiar. To study Athens is to confront a moral paradox. We inherit its ideals: citizenship, debate, law, philosophy, while standing on the same ground where enslaved women were whipped in public squares. We quote Pericles on democracy, forgetting that the women who cooked his meals could be beaten without consequence. We celebrate the tragedies that probe human suffering, but rarely pause to see the silent tragedies enacted daily in kitchens and workshops. Why does this matter? Because every civilization risks repeating the same fracture, proclaiming values for some while denying them to others. Athens is not simply a warning from the past, it is a mirror. When we ask how a society that invented liberty could sustain slavery, we are also asking how modern societies can proclaim human rights while millions remain trafficked and exploited. The question is not rhetorical, it is urgent. Ethical reflection requires naming what was erased. The 5 million women reduced to commodities deserve more than silence. They deserve remembrance as individuals. A Thracian girl, branded in the agora, a Phrygian mother forced to abandon her child, a Lydian nurse singing lullabies in a tongue forbidden in the house she served. Their names are lost, but the act of remembering them as real, as human, is a form of resistance against the logic that made them property. Civilization should not be measured only by its monuments, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. Athens built temples of dazzling beauty, but also burned marks into women's skin. It debated justice in marble courts, but denied justice to those who needed it most. To confront that legacy is not to diminish Athens, it is to understand it fully, without the comforting illusions. The truth is clear. Democracy in Athens was built on chains. And until we learn to see the erased, the silenced, the enslaved, we risk building our own ideals on the same fragile ground. The ruins whisper their lesson. The stones that once framed debates on liberty also cast shadows over women forced into silence. To listen is to accept responsibility to remember their names, not just their numbers. To honor their humanity, not just admire their captors' achievements. Only then can we say we have truly learned from Athens.